Hello, I am Anawultus, and today on Science Fiction Power Scaling, I'm actually going to be talking about something that's a more of a tangential topic, but certainly is still relevant to science fiction power scaling. And that is, you need to, if you're ever making some science fiction, you're writing something, or perhaps you're drawing an image, or you're just brainstorming some ideas, they should, in theory, make sense. In other words, in many cases, many writers don't think everything through, and then you end up with some really janky power scaling at the end when things don't really make 100% sense like they should. So one one element to this that I really would like to talk about is the idea of technological advancement. And, or more accurately, when that refers to the military technology and how that changes as time goes on. So, for example, the Roman army in ancient times, they would adapt to the situations that they encountered. So if if a certain type of weapon isn't effective in a certain battlefield against a certain group of people, then it is only logical that you would change the type of weapon that you're using or find some other way in order to regain or offset the tactical advantages and disadvantages. So, this can also translate to the development of weapons in general, not just in a geographical sense in responding to the weapons of your opponents, but also in a general sense in how weaponry has developed historically. So one example I would say is the contrast between firearms and plate armor, in the sense that when firearms were first invented, specifically anti-personnel weaponry, like the early guns, early hand cannons, etc., that did not make plate armor obsolete. And in fact, at that specific time in history, there was a trend to make plate armor thicker in order to protect against projectiles. And not just projectiles, but also more close combat weapons as well, because making the armor thicker just makes it tougher in general. So one example is that by the end of the Hundred Years' War, the chances of an arrow from a longbow piercing full suits of plate in any of the major areas is very unlikely, as it simply would not have enough force to break through the thickness of the armor. Now, of course, there are some minor areas where it can get through where the armor isn't as thick, and there's also the possibility that a soldier might lift his visor in order to get a better view of the battlefield, and then he gets shot through the visor hole, which is a very common occurrence. But with firearms, there's, of course, also a similar arms race. And just like the bow and arrow lost in the end against plate armor, the firearms eventually won over plate armor, specifically in the sense of the musket. As people started making heavier muskets and longer muskets in order to get the power and the accuracy needed in order to break through thick plate armor. And this is actually one of the reasons why a lot of muskets had to be shot from stands. The other reason was, or another reason, there's multiple reasons, of course, but another reason was that it's just easier to mess with a matchlock that way. But one of the reasons is because they're long guns, and long guns are a bit hard to carry if you're standing up, and you have to carry it all day. You're standing up, and you have to hold it out, which then, of course, gives you a disadvantage in leverage, which is why long guns aren't necessarily the best weapons to carry in battlefield situations if you want to be able to run and gun. But anyway, as I was saying, muskets eventually became so powerful that armorers generally began giving up, because making the armor even thicker than it already was would eventually lead to a loss in mobility, or a loss in stamina due to the weight of the armor that would eventually actually negatively impact the performance of men-at-arms to a much greater degree than having less armor and therefore being vulnerable to musket shots would be. So it's, of course, a calculation of, is it worthwhile? And then eventually armorers said it wasn't worthwhile. And that's why you see armor, plate armor, becoming less popular over time. And especially, you see that especially in the 18th century and the 19th century, when there was still plate armor. It's still used. It just wasn't used as much, and it usually was limited eventually to specific units like fast cavalry, who may still be able to get beyond most infantry fire. Now, that being said, eventually the whole trend reversed. When World War I came around, the entire system of fighting at the time had a lot of machine guns, and you had trenches, and eventually it came to the point with trench warfare that it became difficult for soldiers to gain territory without having extremely high losses. And the amount of territory you could gain was very small in making those advances. So, in essence, the speed that you normally would need in order to fight that way wasn't really as important anymore. What was important was getting soldiers from point A to point B and gaining territory without having excessive losses. Now, there are a few different ways that this played out. And of course, as I'm talking about plate armor and the reintroduction of it, one way was by the creation of ultra-thick armor, which in the end still wasn't useful enough to actually make it into mainstream battlefield use. But it certainly does exist, and you can see photographs of it. You can find those online. Now, when it comes to alternatives, other ways to get past trenches, there's, of course, artillery. By heavy shelling, you can cause an opponent's position in a trench to become untenable, at which point you can advance, but of course that takes time, and you have to establish the artillery in a place where it can fire indirectly, because if you were to place it, if you were to use direct fire artillery, then it of course is susceptible to counter bombardment. In other words, you need to place the artillery in a way that it's not likely that the enemy is going to take it down. So, of course, artillery was used, and that had some effectiveness, but it still lacked the speed that was needed for a rapid advance, because with heavy artillery for indirect fire, you would have to Frequently, it'd be difficult to move because it's very heavy equipment, and it needs to be set up properly in order to, and you need to calculate all the firing arcs to make sure it works well. Now, another method is, of course, air combat, but at the time of World War I, most planes weren't well armored enough in order to avoid anti-personnel weapons. In other words, you could take a machine gun and fire it at a plane, and I believe that's how the Red Baron died. I think someone from the ground fired at him, and it hit him in the heart, and then an opposing fighter pilot then took credit or something. But anyway, so planes are useful, but they still are susceptible to fire, so you still haven't solved the armor problem there. So the two alternatives that there's two more alternatives that I have to discuss. There's, of course, chemical weapons, which, if deployed properly, work very well. And, of course, the big problem is you have to either wait for it to dissipate, or you have to send soldiers with gas masks in order to take the territory. And, of course, you need to deploy the chemical weapons, and you need to make sure that everything is going all right when you release the gas so that it moves in the right direction. And you need to have enough gas for it to actually have an impact on the battlefield, because if you don't have enough, it'll just diffuse and cause minor irritation. So, of course, that, of course, has its own set of problems. But, of course, the thing that I'm talking about now is in regards to armor. So that, of course, is the tank. The tank brought back the speed that was needed for rapid advance. Of course, early tanks aren't as rapid as later tanks would be, but then again, early cars back then, unless it was a race car, wouldn't generally be that fast either. So it wasn't a problem, and also you still wanted your infantry to be able to advance as well. So early tanks, I'd say, were fast enough for the battlefields that they were put on. And that, of course, overcame the problem because you needed a weapon that is safe against the high volume of anti-personnel fire that you would experience in the no man's land between the trenches, and that's what a tank does. It's got plenty of armor that's thick enough to deflect most bullets of the time, and therefore effect an effectual advance with a degree of speed that might not be possible with alternative methods of overcoming the trench. All right, so that's a little brief history analysis, but what does that all mean? Well, what that means is that, especially if you are creating a science fiction universe that has a long and detailed history, the military advancements need to make sense. Just like the tank was invented in order to protect against bullets, in some essence, like the musket was then earlier developed in order to penetrate armor. And so you have this little window of time in which the musket and its derivatives were considered more powerful than armor, and then eventually armor came back with the tank. But this same logic should exist in a fictional universe. In other words, if you are creating a science fiction universe, the technology needs to make sense, even if the actual science behind it doesn't make sense. So, in other words, you shouldn't have two neighboring powers in a science fiction universe where one is completely mismatched to the other in a battle because the battle strategy and the battle tactics and the type of equipment that they use is such a mismatch that one side entirely dominates in a fight. That is, I would call that poor writing. If given the condition that these two powers have had a long time of exposure to each other, there should be at least some effort to make the weaponry effective against potential opponents. Because otherwise, what's the point of having weapons if they don't do anything? But I don't see that too commonly, though, so it's not a huge problem. But it might be a problem sometimes, is what I'm saying. Now, of course, if there's a new power on the block that comes out of nowhere and just defeats everyone, or if someone has highly secretive technology, I can understand why there would be a mismatch. But generally speaking, given exposure to adversaries, a culture will produce weaponry and tactics that are designed specifically to counteract those adversaries. In other words, let's say you have spaceships that are let me think about how to put this. Spaceships that, let's say you end in a time period where there's spaceships, and the spaceship's offensive capabilities are so much greater than the defensive capabilities of those spaceships that armor or shielding, depending on which science fiction universe you're talking about, is ineffective. At that point, you should not expect anyone to apply unnecessarily thick armor to their spacecraft, because the weaponry that is going to be used against it is so effective that it doesn't matter. Unless there is an actual enemy where it is effective against. In other words, every single piece of military technology needs to have its justification. If you have a weapon that you can't use, or a defensive technology that is useless, then you're obviously going to dump them. That's how real militaries work, especially in a war. Now, of course, in peacetime, they may have things lying around just in case. But in a war, what you're actually going to be sending onto the battlefield should be prioritized as equipment that is actually going to be useful. So anyway, that was my brief little talk about how there should be a consistency and a logic to weaponry and weapons technology and tactics and strategies in science fiction. Tell me what you thought. Was it a good idea? I'm probably not 100% accurate on the history in this video, since it wasn't something I studied. I was just talking loosely. So if there's any correction that someone needs to make, feel free to make it. I'll be sure to make sure everybody knows if I've made a mistake there. So anyway, thank you all for watching. As always, I'm always open to a collaboration. If there's something anybody wants to talk to me about, whether it is science fiction or anything else for that matter, except for smut. I don't do smut on this channel. Come on, have some dignity, people. Then feel free to contact me in the comments section below. So thank you all for watching, and I'll be seeing you all next time on Awiltos over and out.